Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line. The Russians have mainly advanced within the Donetsk region, with a singular advance within the Sumy region, where the Russians have secured the southern outskirts of Bilovody, gaining full control over the town. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians managed to make significant gains to the east of Pokrovsk, where they've managed to gain control over the towns of Nativka, Staromykolaivka, further capturing streets within Surya, the central parts of the town. Made several advances north of Alexandropil to the northeast of Novolenivka, gaining a foothold within Yablonivka and gaining some control of some fortified positions here to the west of the town. Russians started storming Popov Yar and Poltavka, gaining a foothold within both of these towns, and managed to gain control over a forest line to the southeast of Poltavka, allowing for a supply road into the town. The Ukrainians managed to make a small counterattack here to the southwest of Pokrovsk, regaining control over a street within the town of Novomykolaivka. The Russians started advancing here west of Oteratne in the direction of Komar, fighting over the fortified positions to the east of the town. The Russians managed to regain control over the northern flank of Berlatske, kicking the Ukrainians out of their counterattack attempt towards the town, and they have managed to secure the southern flank of Novopil, gaining control over the road leading into the town and the central street, fighting the Ukrainians over the western street and northern outskirts of the town, where the Ukrainians have been operationally circled within Zelenopole and Novopil in both of these settlements on the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Starting out here to the south, we see that the Russians have managed to gain control over the fortified positions in the southern parts and are fighting over the fortified positions in the northern parts while getting control over the central street within Novopil. This allows the Russians to kick the Ukrainians to the western outskirts of the town, where they have no roads to escape through. This means they would have to escape through the open fields if they are to withdraw, or to stand their ground until the end. The Russians will then allow themselves to gain control over the fortified positions along the border area and the border area itself to gain full control over the Donetsk region. And with control over Zelenopole, they'll be able to flank Temirivka from the north to start attacking the fortified positions and the defensive line. However, the main focus of the Russians will be to advance west and north of Vilnapole. This is to gain control over the remaining fortified positions, to gain control over Komushavacha, and gain control over the northern defensive line. This will allow the Russians to move in force along the northern flank of this defensive line, completely bypassing it and entering into the Dnipropetrovsk region. This is to flank the first and second lines of defense of the Ukrainians within the Zaporizhia region, to start the battle over the town of Pokrovsk, which is a larger town or a small city here to the west within the Dnipropetrovsk region, which can act as a supply hub for Russian offensive operations, both into the Dnipropetrovsk region and towards the city of Dnipro, in the direction of Zaporizhia itself, or to flank the fortified positions, the first and second lines of defense within the Zaporizhia region. This shows that this will be an extremely important logistical hub for Russian forces for future offensive operations in the Dnipro-Zaporizhia regions. The Russian counterattack securing the northern flank of Berlatske is a step in that direction, where the Russians will look to secure Vesele, the fortified positions around them, and move towards Shevchenko as well. The objective of the Russians will be to start fighting over Komorsk further to the north, flank Fedorivka from the north, while attacking head-on from the south. Gain control over these settlements along the river line will allow the Russians to flank the fortified line from the north, from the rear of these fortified positions, and through their weak point to gain control over them without having to face as much of resistance as storming them directly head-on. And this is also coupled with the offensive operations west of Bahatir, which have started in the direction of Kumar. The Russians are launching offensive operations from the Bahatir direction, as well as from the Vesele direction, and in the fields to the southeast. The objective is to gain control over Kumar, Fedorivka, and move onwards both in the northern and western directions, all with the purpose of gaining control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and moving into the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Ukrainians launched a small counterattack to the southwest of Pokrovsk. This is to regain control over the remaining parts of the southern street, and that is to regain control over additional roads into the town. The Russians have been trying to enter the town from the south. The Ukrainians are here launching the counterattack to prevent that. They're also attempting to regain control over these roads to the south of Mykolaiivka, most importantly the fortified positions in the area, to prevent the Russians from storming the settlement from multiple directions. The Russians are currently making use of several roads from the east and from the south to enter Mykolaiivka, and are so far facing heavy resistance by the Ukrainians here on the border area between the Donetsk and the Dnipropetrovsk regions. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians made significant advances, most notably here to the east, where they managed to gain control over a majority of Staromykolaiivka, the entirety of Nativka, and much of Soria. The Ukrainians are attempting to withdraw from these remaining fortified positions here east of Staromykolaiivka and in the direction of Soria to then go up towards the town of Encircle. However, the Russians have control over Romanivka in the eastern flank and much of Soria in the western flank, which leaves the Ukrainian forces operationally encircled with a small gap to withdraw through. The Russians are looking to close this gap and fully encircle the remaining Ukrainian forces, gain control over the pocket, and then move upwards towards towns such as Kostyantinivka in the northeast, Encircle in the north, and Yablonivka in the northwest. The Russians advanced north of Encircle, gained control of some fortified positions and the forest line, securing an additional road into Soria, and advancing further northwards to secure the northern flank and advance in the direction of Yablonivka, which the Russians have now gained a foothold within. In the western outskirts of the town, the Russians are now fighting over the fortified positions in that flank to gain control over the road leading up to the town via from the south. With the control over the road to the southwest, they will have 2 roads into the town, and they will continue expanding so through the roads here to the east to gain additional roads into Yablonivka, as it is a very wide town. Advancing entirely from the west would be putting themselves at a disadvantage compared to the Ukrainian defenders in the area. Widening the front line and having additional roads into the town will allow the Russians to strengthen their offensive capabilities and to spread out their forces attacking the town. To the west of Yablonivka, the Russians can control also fortified positions along the main highway, advancing towards the northern flank of Yablonivka along the northern bank of the Vychok River. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the fortified positions to the north of the town at the same time as advancing through the town itself. The Russians stormed both Popiv Yar and Poltavka. As we can see, the Russians gain control over the southern outskirts of both of these towns, gaining a foothold within the first streets, and also securing some of the forest lines in those directions for supply lines into these towns. The Russians have a road leading up to these towns, and they now also have control over some forest lines, which leaves several areas from which the Russians can advance into the towns from. The Russians will likely expand that as well to widen their front line here in this section of the front line as well. Gain control over Popiv Yar and Poltavka, as well as the fortified positions to the northwest and the industrial area, will allow them to secure the fire control they need over the supply line of the Ukrainians that connects Doroshivka with Pokrovsk, gaining control over an area close to this supply line. And we can see that there are 2 roads leading into Pokrovsk from the north. There's the highway directly to the north, where if the Russians gain control over the western flank of these settlements, which I have previously drawn out in an analysis, saying that the Russians will need to gain control over this to operationally encircle Pokrovsk, they'll be able to strike this northern highway from the western flank, gaining operational control, fire control over this highway and operationally encircling the city. If the Russians also cut off the eastern flank by aligning the front line here to the east with the towns such as Myrne, Kopcheve, Shevchenko-Pershe, and upwards towards Popiv Yar and Poltavka, the Russians will be able to strike the entire area into the north of Mirnorad and Pokrovsk, gaining operational fire control over the city and therefore operationally encircling Pokrovsk and Mirnorad. The Russians are close to gain control over the eastern flank and are moving to gain control over the southern flank of Kostyantinivka as well, with the recent advances in the Chasiv Yar direction also pointing towards operational control over the north of Kostyantinivka. This will lead to operational encirclement of both Kostyantinivka and Pokrovsk, where the remaining amount of territory the Russians need to gain full control over these areas amount to approximately 820 square kilometers of territory, which based on the current rate of advances by the Russian forces, is approximately 33 days, which still aligns with my initial estimate that it would be at the end of June or at the start of July that the Russians would have reached such positions. The main Russian advances this month have been targeted and centered around the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and the northern parts of the Donetsk city in the direction of Kostyantinivka, while there's been minor advances in the direction of Pokrovsk and to the north of Toretsk, as well as the Chasiv Yar direction. These are all areas where the Russians don't need to advance as much as in other sections, such as the areas where they've advanced a lot more. And this points towards a general attempt by the Russians to concentrate in the areas where they lack the most. And once they have closed the gap and the differences between the southern flank and the northern flank, they'll start a general offensive on the wide front to attack from every single direction to reach this operational encirclement of both cities, both Kostyantinivka in the north and Pokrovsk in the south. This means we can expect offensive operations by the Russians west of Pokrovsk picking up strength significantly once the Russians have secured additional supply lines towards the western flank of the city. We may see an attempt by the Russian forces to launch an offensive operation into the Dnipropetrovsk region. This could be a stronger offensive similar to the ones to the south of Kostyantinivka, where the Russians will look to gain control over 10, 15, 20 square kilometers a day to strengthen their supply lines on the western flank of Pokrovsk for the operational encirclement of the city. Further north, the Russians have managed to gain control over the southern flank of Belovody, gaining control over the remaining residential areas and the forest patches within the town. The Russians here are slowly securing both river lines, both the western one and the eastern one, to gain control over Yunakivka, Yablonivka, and the highway area here to the southwest of Sucha, to expand the zone of control within the Sumy region and to establish their first major logistical hub for their forces within the Sumy region for further offensive operations in the future, whether it be their buffer zone or simply these small incursions to divert Ukrainian forces. In either case, the Russians are slowly advancing forward, despite their main focus being on the eastern section of the front line, the Donetsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.